Good evening, everybody, and welcome to just this short, reflection or question posing based on the sermon that we had on Sunday. Sunday, we were looking together, as we've been doing for the last couple of weeks, at the letter to the Corinthian Jesus following community. And so we're in the first letter, and we're up to chapter 5. And on Sunday, we was talking a tricky subject, really tricky to know how to put things and not skirt around the edges. But we were looking at the issue of sexual immorality, but it was of a particular kind in the church that would have been shocking even to the pagans around the Jesus following community. It was a case of incest. And Paul relates that for some reason, the church itself was somehow boasting that this was a good thing. And so we looked at Sunday, really, as you should always do when you're teaching scripture, what is the context which gives rise to this kind of writing from Paul. And then when we look at what Paul is proposing, then we can sort of lift the principles and say, well, listen, we might not get an issue like this today, but are the principles underpinning how Paul sort of, speaks to the church, are those principles still relevant? We came up with 4 C's, didn't we? Crisis, challenge, consecration, and cutting. 4 things. And so we noted, first thing was identifying where there is an issue that is challenging, an issue that really, for Paul, compromises the witness or the separateness of the church from the society around it. So, first thing is to be frank and honest about where there are issues of character and conduct which, as such, that they might engender a sort of destruction of the building of the temple known as the church. Second thing, then, we looked at Paul issuing a challenge to do something about this based on the principles of the gospel. And I was saying on Sunday, one of the biggest things when it comes to challenge, what I think Paul was really getting at is this should not be happening because you should be in agreement about character and conduct in these areas of life. And until you've got that nailed down, you're always going to have awkward conversations where if it's known what you stand in agreement for and with, then that in itself sort of mitigates against having to do some of the other things that are suggested. It mitigates against awkward conversations. Being vocal and public about theological stances on issues is an incredible help in ensuring that everybody buys into the journey of the church. So that was the challenge. And then I looked at the idea of consecration, because really one of Paul's big things is that we are consecrated, we are set apart, we are separate. And I said that actually one of the things we need to focus on is our set apartness is we are grounded in Jesus Christ and the gospel of Jesus Christ. We said one of the prevailing things that would have been happening in Corinth, sexually at least, is what would now be considered abuse of children, pedophilia. It was seen as a very different thing in that society. And the abuse of women, or the use of women's bodies and all of that kind of stuff. And we said that in the gospel of Jesus Christ, we see Jesus redignifying children and women and raising them to a place of equality with men in a society that was thoroughly on the side of men. We've still got societies like that now, religions and theologies that buy into a sort of patriarchal structure. So therefore, to be consecrated is to mirror and reflect the attitude of Jesus to people. So therefore, we don't abuse women, we don't see them as half a man, and we certainly do not play the business of abuse with children. Now, of course, the bigger issue for Paul is the incest bit, which is above and beyond those two characteristics. But really our grounding, our set apartness is because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And now Paul writes, doesn't he? The cutting word is all about if there isn't, via conversation, any, clear sense that somebody is going to put down this behaviour and turn away from it, then there has to be a kind of cutting off. Paul puts it like, hand them over to Satan so that their flesh might be punished and that ultimately a door might be opened for their spirit to be saved. But there can come times where there needs to be these parting of the ways with people. But we did say on Sunday, there is a disclaimer that Paul still leaves the door open, particularly in verse 5, for the possibility of even the greatest offender being saved. So, those were the things we looked at. So tonight we might ask the question, what are some of the things around us that trouble us? And some of the attitudes that might have crept into the church that are not helpful, are not wholesome. Now, let me just do a disclaimer here because the challenge bit is next. I'm not talking about things like same-sex marriage or a person being gay and a Christian, because that's orientation. And just by virtue of somebody saying they're gay does not mean they are hook, line and sinker some kind of disgusting abomination. If Jesus redignifies people, he redignifies all people, apart from those who choose the path of death, a different path. So I just want to make that clear that our church is affirming. So there might be crisis points within how we see things, but let me just say this about the word challenge, our next question. So where are the crises, or what are the worries for us as church? But the challenge always is to be clear about where we stand on a number of contemporary issues. Now, let me just ask you the question then. Would somebody who just walks off the street into our church recognise anything that would make them think this is an affirming church, apart from some of the style of my preaching? But would they know? Is it important that they know? Do we need to let them know so that they don't find out after they've sown a lot of their life into the community, so that we can have a journeyed and good and upfront adult discussion about our theology? We're getting more children now. Do we need to be more upfront about our safeguarding? What we've agreed to as a church when it comes to the protective characteristics of children and vulnerable adults? Is that something that is recognised if somebody walks into the church? Are we upfront? It's no good us working out our theology of inclusion just to think, well, we'll sort of leave it in a cupboard somewhere and just hope people sort of, crack on. No. And Paul's saying this here, isn't it? He's saying if you had full agreement, then the issue that's arisen would be mitigated against in a better way than Paul's saying. It's a challenge. Okay. Consecration. One thing we do need to think about is with our relationships with people, is Jesus at the centre of those relationships? Are our actions such that they re-dignify people? Now let's just go down to just verse 10. This is one to explore, Because even though Paul says don't associate with sexually immoral persons, and he says, well, with brothers and sisters who are doing stuff like this incestuous stuff, but he does say, listen, anyone who's immoral, greedy, idolatrous, a reveler, a drunkard, or a robber. Think about all of those categories, not just one of them, all of them. Do any of our ways reflect that we are greedy people? That we are idolatrous, we're revelers, we're drunkards, we're robbers? You know, let's ask the big picture questions and not just automatically scapegoat one aspect of a community we think might embody this, okay? So, consecration, living a separate life, but it also means that we have to be on our guard against these kinds of things, okay? Lastly is cutting. So the question might be, or the discussion, how do we do that well? When we know that somebody cannot journey with us, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with those that might want to drag the church back to a place of saying all sexual minorities and gender minorities are abominable and should not be allowed in the church, when we've stood and agreed that that's not the case? And what do we do when the label of sexual immorality is only put on the gay community specifically, when I know that sexual immorality is more than prevalent in the straight world? Absolutely. The swinging 60s was a straight phenomena, folks. So it's not fair to build up a caricature of one sexual or gender minority, which just hides our own sexual immorality in the background, and we don't even look at it and apologise for it. So, but how do we do the cutting bit? What is the best way that when we meet people that are bringing or introducing the wrong stuff into the church, what is the best way? Is it a clean cut, or is it a conversation? Because we're upfront about what we declare about certain issues, so that the accountability is already there and we can move on. And the analogy might be that, less here, but that sometimes the branch has to go somewhere else and get grafted into another community because it might pollute ours. So how do we do those things? So crisis, challenge, consecration, and cutting. Have a chat and see how you get on. And I shall see you on Sunday. God bless you all.